a lot of skeptics would be very surprised about the amount of documentary evidence that we have for this event. So I have a link uh, in the video description below, which is by an article by a physicist at Stanford. His name is Dr. Aaron Wall. But he also runs this blog where he has a lot of very cool articles about both physics and theology. And one of the things that he gave is he did a defense of the resurrection from a Bayesian point of view. Now, if you've taken a statistics class in college, you may be familiar with this methodology already. But if you haven't, I think now is a good time for an explanation. So a Bayesian approach essentially says that if we want to look at the likelihood of an event, we don't just say that it has a low probability because it seems incredible. As skeptics will often say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which I would agree with. However, the question is, what constitutes extraordinary evidence? And I think this is what a Bayesian approach is really good at. To give some context, think about the 9/11 attacks. I'm only 20 years old, so I can barely remember it, but I'm sure most of you probably remember this pretty vividly, and very well may have remembered when the first plane hit the tower, followed by the second. And many people thought, after the first plane had hit, that maybe it wasn't planned, maybe it was just an accident, because it's very unlikely for things like this to happen. On an average day, you don't think that a plane's just going to be flying into the World Trade Center. However, after the second plane hit, people realized that, hey, wait a second. Even though it was very unlikely for an event like this to happen, specifically that there would be a terrorist attack on the United States, a planned attack on the Twin Towers, the fact that you had two planes hitting made the probability that there was an accident dramatically, dramatically smaller. So how does this relate to Christianity? Well, it relates to the mode of thinking that we have to have when we're examining any form of claim or argument. So what people instinctually do is a form of Bayesian reasoning. When you have new evidence, you have to update your probability of your position. So in this case, if your initial probability of there being a terrorist attack in the United States during the morning of September 11th, 2001, is 10 to the negative third. Then you have an event that occurs. And that event is the first plane hitting the tower. Well, what you have to do is you have to say, well, what's the probability that this event would occur given that there was no terrorist attack? Well, you'd probably say something very small, maybe 10 to the negative fourth. What's the probability that the event would occur given a terrorist attack? Well, 1. So what this effect does is saying that this changes your probability calculus, because by a magnitude of 4, you see that there's this event is 10 to the 4th times more likely to occur under the event that there was an actual terrorist attack than the event that there wasn't. So your initial probability, which let's just say is 10 to the negative 6th, well, that goes to 10 to the negative 2nd. The specific calculations could discuss further. I have a link to a very good explanation of Bayes' rule. But I think the key principle with respect to this discussion is that you need to keep updating your probabilities in response to new information. So here's what happens. That first event was enough for people to say, okay, well, I still think there's a very good chance this is an accident, but this is significant. So let's just say your initial probability was 10 to the negative 6th, and it updated to 10 to the negative 2nd with the new information that you had. Well, let's say you had another event of that sort. Well, think about the second one. Well, that would change, say, from something like 10 to the negative 2nd to 0.999. Why is that? Well, it's because the despite the improbability of the event, the evidence so overwhelms the initial improbability that you have no choice but to accept that there was a terrorist attack that had occurred today. And I think the same reasoning can very much be applied to the resurrection. So I'm going to be reading from Dr. Wall's article because I think it's very insightful as to these points. So if you are unfamiliar with the New Testament, I think you may want to do some research on this particular points presented. But I will say this, that it's very much within the mainstream of New Testament scholarship. So let me read. He says that when it comes to the historical testimony to the resurrection, I, meaning Aaron Wall, has analyzed the data in terms of a set of minimal facts, which I think even a liberal biblical critic ought to accept. By the liberal view, I mean someone who thinks that the Gospels, which are the first 4 books in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts, half the letters of Paul, such as, say, the book of Romans or 1 Corinthians, and the general epistles, which encompasses things like the book of Hebrews, the book of James, etc. They're saying that all these books were pretty much all written in the closing decades of the 1st century by people other than the traditional authors, but that nevertheless the texts are based in identifiable early sources, which go back to some real and much earlier written or oral traditions about Jesus. Now, where Dr. Wall points out in later paragraphs is that this isn't actually what he believes. As an evangelical Christian, he does believe that in the traditional authorship that's ascribed to these books. So he believes that Matthew actually wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, etc. Nonetheless, he's arguing from the perspective of a skeptic who would say that, well, we don't know who wrote these books. So in this case, what he does is he says, okay, well, what are the main pieces of evidence that weigh for Christianity and weigh against it? So I think the way I would look at this is that, you know how I was saying there's a very low prior probability that that there'd be a terrorist attack on September 11th. We can apply the same thing to Christianity. There's many claims of Christianity that seem bizarre, and as such that would decrease the likelihood that we would believe it to be true. So Dr. Wall here describes it as A1, A2, A3, and B as the 4 arguments. A1 is the prior probability due to the specificity of Christian doctrine. So this is just saying that things like saying that, you know, look, there's all of these different religions, saying that this is the only one and that all these things are true, you know, given that so many people don't believe it, that is something that would make you think, okay, this is less likely. Similarly with A2, the weirdness of Christian doctrine. Obviously, things like the Trinity are confusing doctrines, and we may think, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And admittedly, we would say that, yeah, these are things that do, at least to our intuitions, would make it seem like it's less likely that Christianity is true. A3 is the prior probability due to Jesus being only one of billions of people. I think this kind of overlaps with A1 and A2, but it just boils down to saying, okay, the fact that the religion based on this one man, why would it be true as opposed to any other man? And then argument B is the argument from evil. So you see the first 3 arguments all kind of go together, and then B is something entirely on its own, which is obviously something that's been debated for a long time. So what Wall continues on to do is to say that, look, there's these pieces of evidence, C, D, E, and F, that he would argue take that prior probability, and these things provide so much evidence against a naturalistic or materialistic worldview, provide so much evidence in favor of Christianity, in favor of an intelligent God that's in charge of the universe, that it would be very much like with 9/11. That yes, it's very unlikely that a terrorist attack would occur that day as you get up. But as you get that additional data, then a logical person would have to reassess their beliefs in light of the overwhelming evidence. So what are the arguments that he discusses here? Well, I think I have a real strong interest in argument C, the fine-tuning version of the argument for design. I think it's something that definitely has to be reckoned with by skeptics. Historically, for cosmologies postulated a steady-state universe. However, now the scientific consensus is that there was a beginning to space and time. We also see that there used to be seen as a very high probability of life outside of just this planet. And we've discovered that there are more and more parameters that need to be just right in order for there to be life. This is very much consistent with a Christian worldview, which would state that God created life specifically for humans on this earth. And we see that all these things have to be just right for there to be life. The fact that there's life at all would seem to suggest that there is a creator, there is an intelligent force. However, the primary arguments that Wall is discussing are facts surrounding the life of Jesus, and specifically the miracles that surround them. So, first, we'll look at argument D, which are that there are a lot of circumstantial facts of Jesus' life prior to his death that make him more likely to be the Messiah. Here's a good example. Think about the book of Isaiah. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's a book from the Old Testament, and it was written many centuries before Jesus' lifetime. And if you look at chapter 53, I would wager that anyone who just reads it would say that it very much parallels Jesus' life. Now, does this prove Jesus is the Messiah? No. But it is very interesting that we see that much of his life story seems to very much match up with what the descriptions of the Messiah were. Now, some people, skeptics, would argue, well, yes, but this is because this is how the authors of the Bible intended to present Jesus so that he would match those messianic descriptions. That's fair, but the fact that the movement had so many followers would at least suggest that there had to be some historical basis on these claims, and the fact that they could be made at all without any historical reference that opposes them, such as even skeptical accounts during the early church confirmed the crucifixion. Well, that seems to suggest something in favor of Jesus actually being the Messiah. And then E is multiple testimonies to the resurrection. And I think this is important because what we have here is that if you look at a guy named Gary Habermas, what he did is he looked at the scholarship surrounding the New Testament. And he said, what are a set of facts that even non-believing and skeptical scholars would concede? And two of them were that Jesus' disciples believed they saw the risen Jesus, and that there was an empty tomb, that where Jesus was buried, and him being crucified is even more of an established fact, but where he was buried, that tomb was found empty. His disciples believed that he rose again and that they saw him, and he appeared to them. So what does that tell us? Well, if the naturalistic worldview were true, this would be pretty improbable for both of these events to have happened. Obviously, it's possible, but this is certainly evidence that seems to suggest that there is a supernatural realm, because the other explanations for the resurrection, such as the body being stolen, all these visions being hallucinations, the disciples lying, all of them are fairly improbable. So what we have to do is we have to say, okay, the resurrection, that may sound improbable, but how improbable do the naturalistic explanations sound? And I think that if you do some digging into these, you'd find that all of them rely on assumptions that in and of themselves are very unlikely. And as such, what this would do is that this would require you to update your prior probability of Christianity being incorrect, and you'd have to go up significantly, because you'd say, well, look, all this evidence does not seem to fit within my naturalistic paradigm. So that's kind of what D and E do. And F is a very interesting one. There's a great guy named Craig Keener, and he wrote a book called Miracles. I haven't read it, but I have watched some YouTube videos in which he documents some of the things that both he has witnessed and people who he's interviewed as witness. And these things would seem to be very inconsistent with our naturalistic understanding of the universe. Obviously, there is a chance that these were all hallucinations. Nonetheless, if we're looking at it from a Bayesian framework, we'd say, well, these things are a lot more likely under a theistic paradigm. So the question is, and so here's the thing that I think is very substantial, is St. Paul's testimony. Because he was previously hostile, because he wasn't close to Jesus during his lifetime, the chances of people seeing visions of him would be a lot less than it would be with his disciples. All the factors surrounding his conversion in the early dates of his letters from the 50s and 60s all point to this being an authentic movement, all confirm many of the original Christian claims, and it shows, it at least suggests that there is a supernatural realm. So what's kind of the takeaway that we get from all of this? Well, this is my first video, but what I would encourage any skeptic to do is to take a look at the historical evidence for Jesus, to read the four Gospels with an open mind, and then specifically to look at the level of documentary evidence we have for the New Testament, to look at what scholars say are very much established facts about Jesus, and then say, okay, under which worldview, under which paradigm are these facts more likely to have occurred in? Is it more likely that you would have these people who claim they saw miracles, who claim they saw the risen Jesus, to have this guy named Paul who was an enemy of Christianity, who essentially gave up everything and had this crazy conversion experience? Which is more likely, that these were all hallucinations, or that there is a supernatural God who sent his own son, Jesus Christ, to die for our sins? And I would encourage everyone simply to take a look at that evidence, and you will come to your conclusion, but I hope and pray that you would do this fully informed, that you wouldn't simply dismiss these claims by saying that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and then not looking into the evidence yourself. So to conclude this first video, I just want to say I hope you all have a good night, and in the link below, I'll have a couple of links. One is that link from Dr. Wall, who basically goes into these probabilistic calculations and how he arrives at the conclusions he did. And the second one is just a primer on basic Bayesian probability theory. So God bless and have a great day.